So, first of all, before we get started, we've had over 25 questions submitted to us. I sort of narrowed it down over to sort of the top 8 questions that I saw in my mind, and sort of what I tried to generalize and summarize what most people were trying to say and put them into some modified questions. Um, so why not get started? I started this club really this organization really to target political polarization, which, now we see is it's just completely transcended what what I saw, at least in my personal experience, to be even possible. And to start off, I sort of wanted to ask you personally, and if you could answer this sort of on a personal level, how important do you believe bipartisanship to be? And are there any downsides, would you say, into being too bipartisan or being, I guess the word is, you know, too accepting of everybody's idea when, you're registered to a party? So I'm just curious your opinions on that.
No, I mean, look, I think bipartisanship is not only critical but essential. I really think that we've got to do a better job as elected officials, putting partisanship aside and ensuring that we're trying to move the ball forward for the people that we represent. And that for me doesn't mean being Republican enough or Democratic enough or whatever it means. It really means doing what's best for my communities and the people that live there and work there and are raising their families there, regardless of party. The way I like to put it is no one party has a monopoly on all the good ideas. I think it's critical that we keep an open mind and try to, consider other people's perspectives. I think that's how we all grow just as people, hearing different perspectives and really, thinking about those perspectives, particularly in a governmental sense, I think is actually healthy and really helps us grow as people. But I also think it's best for the country, for our state, for our county, and even our local governments as well.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Obviously, we talked about sort of how political polarization is at an all-time high. And I was curious, sort of the current state in the Pennsylvania state legislature regarding the polarization. Since the time you've been in office, have you seen polarization grow between the parties, or what's it like with firsthand experience?
So it's been a little bit of an ebb and flow. When I first came into the House, Governor Corbett was elected, who's obviously a Republican, and the House had flipped from Democrat to Republican. And the Senate remained in Republican hands. And so I've been fortunate. I've been in the majority as a Republican since I was first elected in 2010. In 2014, we saw Governor Corbett lose and Governor Tom Wolf be elected. And so, around that election time, I think partisanship, ticked up a little bit. In the House, we're up every other year. So it tends to run in cycles, believe it or not, in the spring of an election year, so even numbered years. You'll see a lot of what I'll call red meat Republican issues that many of my colleagues who have primaries are advancing because they want to be able to, pound their chest to say, they are the most Republican candidate running for office. And so I usually find that in even numbered years in the spring, as we approach a primary, the primary election season, for many of my colleagues, a primary is really important. On the Democratic side, if you're in Philadelphia, for instance, it is almost impossible in many districts for a Republican to get elected. So the primary is the only contest there. In rural Pennsylvania, in many districts, the primary is the only contest there because a Democrat can't get elected. So I found that during that time of year, in the spring of even numbered years, the partisanship tends to flare a little bit. Okay. In 2018, when again the governor was on the ballot, I think things ticked up a little bit in terms of partisanship. By and large, I think we work on a pretty bipartisan basis. Most bills are, there's broad bipartisan support, and they pass with pretty resounding numbers. It's those times a year that I mentioned where you tend to see the votes get really close and be more party line votes.
Okay. Now, On a more personal level, again, when you're in the House, how does your party alignment affect your personal relationships with your colleagues? Do you tend to be, obviously, as a Republican, closer on a personal level to the Republicans, or would you say, you're the type of person that works with everybody, and I guess is the type of person that's friendly with everyone?
Yeah, so it's funny because this goes back to my time at Hatboro Horsham. When I was in high school and even through college, I was the guy who got along with everybody. You know, you had, I don't know if it's still that way today, but certainly, athletes tend to hang out with one another and spend more time together. And folks in the theater and the arts and the band and everything, they were hanging out on their own, and those relationships existed. And I had friends, sort of across the spectrum there. The same was true when I went to college. I joked I was not in a fraternity, but I had friends in just about every fraternity. And so it's the same now that I'm in, the House of Representatives, in as much as I have very good relationships on both sides of the aisle. I have, good friends who are Democrats, and I have, good friends who are Republicans. It is a little bit like, some of those things that I was mentioning earlier. If you're on a team, for instance, if you're on the baseball team, you're probably going to be spending a lot of time with the other folks on the baseball team.
Hmm.
And so, in terms of your question, who do you spend the most time with? I probably spend the most time with Republicans because we're on the same schedule. The meetings that we have, the conversations, just our schedule is generally the same. And so we're eating at the same time. We're going to meetings at the same time. We're heading to the floor of the House on the same time. We're going back. And when I say, our schedules, I mean, I really have two lives. I work in the district, Horsham Township, Montgomery Township, Upper Dublin, and Lower Gwynedd. But I have another office 100 miles away in Harrisburg where I spend a fair amount of time as well. So when we're, the time that we're in Harrisburg, a lot of times, it's Republicans are all there together at a certain time because that's the way the schedule worked out. So I think, to answer your question, I tend to spend probably a little bit more time with Republicans, but that doesn't mean that, again, going back to the analogy, just because I'm on the baseball team doesn't mean I don't have friends who are, in the theater or in the band or, even in another sport. So I definitely have friends that, on the other side of the aisle, and we find time to, grab a bite to eat or, get together to watch a game. One of the things that I really love about the House is the collegiality. We have just a great camaraderie between one another. And, there's a constant, I can tell you, one of the first things that happened to me when I was on the floor of the House of Representatives is one of my colleagues from Western PA walked up the aisle and he put like a cellophane cigarette wrapper
Hmm.
on my desk on the floor of the House upside down. It's a little rectangular
Yeah.
cube of cellophane.
Yeah.
And he said, "You know what that is?" And now this was back in 2010, and he couldn't do this today, but he said, "You know what that is?" I said, "No, what?" He said, "It's the Philadelphia Eagles trophy cabinet." And and so, I think we have a great, a great banter there. A lot of times we're in session on a Monday, and so during Monday Night Football, we'll all be out together. And you see things, more regionally in terms of that collegiality.
Hmm.
If the Steelers are playing, if it's depending on who they're playing, the Eagles fans may be on the other side of it, or vice versa. So we, those are types of things that I think really help to bring people together and cut through the partisanship.
Yeah.
Those social activities, those opportunities to interact on a more human level.
Yeah.
It's not about politics, not about the vote you put up. It's about whether you like the Steelers, the Pirates, the Phillies, the Eagles, or then, some of my friends from South Central Pennsylvania, they're big Baltimore Ravens fans and Orioles fans. And so you throw them in the mix. And then you got folks up in the Northeast. Some of them are Mets fans. So
We
a
don't
lot
like
of us,
those. We don't like them as much.
no, that's for sure. There's not a lot of Dallas Cowboy fans, but
That's good.
yeah, but there are some Giants fans, some Mets fans up in the Northeast. But that type of stuff I think really helps cut through some of that partisanship and allow us to get to know one another as humans.
So, one of the things that I wanted to ask you, and this is one of my personal questions, is, um, as a local, as somebody that represents, um, not on a federal level, on a state level, there's a certain element, I guess, of personability, or being able to be personable with the people that you represent. And the question that I have for you is, how do you balance sort of your own political agenda with your constituents' priorities? Is there a specific way you would go about balancing, your personal beliefs and what would you say? Is there a specific balance, or does it vary based on an issue by issue basis? What are your thoughts on that?
It's interesting. It's a great question, and it's something that early on I really had to work through.
Mhm.
I actually, I had interned. I got involved with politics because I had interned with State Representative George Sowerman. Now, George was my predecessor in this seat. I guess three state reps before me, and he's actually still my constituent today. He's in his 90s. He's a World War II vet. He's a terrific guy. But when I was first elected, I would meet up with George pretty regularly. I would go to lunch with him and sought his counsel on something along this lines. And he brought up a great point. He said, "Well, George, what do you do? What do you do when in your heart you believe the right answer is A, but your constituents are telling you B?" And he said, "Look, you got to always remind yourself you are there to represent the people in your district, but that doesn't mean that you can't have your own thoughts." And he said, "What I always did was I always I always tried to think of how my constituents would feel if they had all the same information that I had." Um, one of the beauties of my job is I have access to tremendous amounts of information that average individuals may not be aware of.
Mhm.
I get daily briefings right now. We're dealing with all the COVID-19 stuff. We get daily briefings from the administration, the Secretary of Health. We're in constant communication with executives in our hospitals and nursing homes and things like that. And so, I'm privy to a lot more information than a lot of other folks, may be. And so when I make decisions, I make the best decision I can for the people that I represent, assuming that they had all the same information I had. So in other words, if they had all the information, they had access to all the data and all the information that I had, how would they feel about the issue then? And that's how I try to, conduct myself and cast my votes. One of the things that I've always been able to do, and look, my job, I get it. I'm never going to make everybody happy. And, I have to do my best to represent the entirety of my district, which is a very diverse district. But, that being said, what I also need to be able to do, and what I've found with the people I represent is, if I have a well-reasoned, thoughtful rationale for however I cast my vote, there are people, they'll call me and they'll be really upset with the vote I cast. And when I explain to them, I had this information, this data from this person, I knew, this information over here, and whatever the data or background or additional information I had, when I explain that to them, sometimes they'll come around, not often, but sometimes they'll come around and say, "Well, I get it, I'm with you." But, it's almost every time that they don't end up agreeing with me. They say to me, "You know what, Todd, I at least appreciate you had a good reason. And, you worked through it. You were thoughtful about it. You did your homework. You understood the issue. And even though I don't necessarily agree with your final conclusion, I do appreciate the fact that you took the time and effort to listen and consider my point of view and, make an informed, thoughtful decision on it." So I think that's really the key. I think people want you to be thoughtful, and I joke with people all the time who are new. The number one thing you can do in this job is listen. You got to listen. And when I say listen, it's not just, in one ear, out the other. It's listen and then, really contemplate what people are talking to you about. Think about their point of view and their perspective. Try to put yourself in their shoes. I think that's really critical for people who are in positions like mine. And so it goes a long way to helping you understand. When I say listen, I am very approachable. When I'm at the Little League field or the grocery store, I don't mind at all people coming up and, sometimes people want to ask my opinion. More often than not, they want to give me theirs. And that's great because it helps me. It helps me understand their point of view and their perspective. And that lets me, helps me do my job better.
I'll never forget. I remember we were at Lancers on a Saturday morning, and I remember seeing you there because I remember seeing you throughout middle school and the eighth grade jazz band we went to go see. We got to tour the Capitol building, and I remember seeing just this line of like six people, all I guess waiting to talk to you. And I think it's really interesting. I guess sort of the way that I grasp it is sort of you have to be a man of the people in a sense. You got to take what your constituents want, and um, you got to interpret that, but at the same time prioritize what they believe. And I think that's a great message. And sort of going off of that, what's the first thing you look for in a bill, or something, an idea that somebody proposes to determine your stance on it? And does that once again come down to what your constituents think, or what's that first step for you in determining your side of something?
Yeah. So the number one thing that I look at right out of the gate is what's the effect of this going to be in my community? So if I'm looking at a bill that deals with education, okay, well, how's this going to affect the schools in my district? And not just the public schools. I have a number of private schools too, and a number of families that are sending their children to private schools. So in general, how is this going to be? How is this going to affect them? I joke, boots on the ground. Like I want to know what's going to be the actual impact. And this gets back to the fact that I have available to me a lot of great resources and information. But it's not uncommon for me to pick up the phone or send an email over to somebody in my district to ask them how this will affect them. If it's about schools, I might reach out to superintendents or principals. If it's about health issues, I might reach out. I've got a lot of physicians in my district. I may reach out to one of them. Or if it's about it could be about energy policy. I'll reach out to folks who are in that field, whether it's folks at PICO or someone else. So for me, it's all about what's the impact going to be in my district, in the communities that I represent. And, not just from a theoretical 30,000 foot level, but like on a day-to-day practical application, what's this going to mean?
So on a totally different note, I want to take this. Somebody sent us a pretty interesting question that I thought would be interesting to hear your take on. And the question was, as a member of one of the two biggest political parties in the United States, what is your viewpoint on third parties? How would you say they promote or do they hinder the democratic process? I know it's completely sort of different than what we've been talking about, but I was curious to hear your response to that as well.
Look, I think they're terrific. I think that they, bring a perspective that's really important. As I said before, I don't think any one party has a monopoly on good ideas, and I don't think two parties, have a monopoly on good ideas. I think that that diversity of thought, that diversity of opinion, is really important. I think it all needs to be thrown, into the discussion so that we can really have a thoughtful dialogue about what the best move forward is for all of us. So I welcome them. Can you imagine if your school only had two clubs, not even just political clubs, like two clubs, that's it. You could either be in the school play or you can play football. That's it, nothing else. Those are the only two choices you've got. That would be, a really terrible proposition. And I think this is largely the same way.
So I don't want to keep you for too long, but I have one final question for you. And that's sort of a bigger picture, on a national level. What would your message be to younger people like myself, or, people who are in college right now, or even younger than I am? What's your message to the people that see political polarization, decreasing the efficiency of our government as a whole? Is there a big picture message that you'd like to deliver, sort of?
Yeah, look, I think it's really important. And I think that to the extent that group of folks who is really concerned about partisanship, I think you just need to stay focused, stay passionate about it. Don't be afraid to speak up. I think that's really the key to it. Don't be afraid to let your voice be heard. Let people know that you appreciate that they crossed the party line to vote for something. Let people know that they appreciate that you're considering an alternative point of view. I think that's really important. Be vocal, respectfully. Be respectful about it, but be vocal. And so I think that if you share your perspective on it, share your thoughts on it with elected officials from both sides of the aisle, I think the more people do that, the more it will be embraced, and become the norm.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Yeah, no problem. I hope this worked out for you.